Okay, we're back on the Chase Your Dreams podcast, and we're talking about movies. We're basically on set right now.
Feels like it.
Yeah. And we're talking about syncing audio to video, and that is not at all the conversation for today, but it was a nice little starting point. So, hello.
Hello.
How we doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's great to be with you here today. I think maybe we can start with some real quick introductions. Let's do name, title, and how about just like a real brief how you got to this work? You know what I mean? Just we can go back as far as you need to, but just kind of the why behind what it is that you're doing. Yeah. And we can start with you, Erin.
Okay. Well, hi, I'm Erin Hambrick, and I'm a clinical child psychologist by training. So my kind of focus area throughout my life has been kids who've experienced trauma. And now I am the coordinator for the TASN Technical Assistance System Network School Mental Health Initiative. We work throughout the state of Kansas, really providing technical assistance to schools and their partners to help, meet the really deep mental health needs, I think, of children today.
Awesome. And TASN, so when I first learned what TASN was, somebody said it was the right hand of the Department of Education. Do you feel like that's a fair assessment, or how would you describe TASN?
Yeah, I'll start, but I'll let Laura jump in. I think that is, I hadn't heard that before, but I like that because, the State Department of Education, I think has such a broad initiative. They're looking after every element of children's education. And so they have kind of developed this system of people who specialize in certain areas that schools could potentially use technical assistance for. And, school mental health being one, but also, autism and tertiary behavior supports being another, right? There are all these sorts of niche areas that KSDE can really serve people better when they have relationships with people who really specialize in these certain areas. I don't know, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think sometimes people see the Department of Education as sort of compliance, right? And there is some element of that is necessary and important to track, and it can be difficult, I think, for the school districts to then also see them as help and service providers. So I think in a way that with TASN can come in more of a help and support without that sort of conflicting relationship of
regulation.
That
makes a lot of sense. And I'm sorry, I asked a follow-up question before Laura even had a chance to introduce herself.
My name's Laura Hattrup, and I'm a clinical social worker by training. My specialty, I guess we would say, was school social work. And so I spent a lot of years working in the school system. I really enjoyed that because I got to see the individual work with children and group work and a lot of work with families, and then also with the teachers and administration. So it was a fun place to do that individual piece. And then especially later in my career, I did much more systems work and really getting to see the impact on multiple levels, and just saw the power of I had opportunities, some really good learning experiences in what can happen for children and families and staff when your system becomes more trauma responsive. And just I came to this work because wanting to have an impact like that on a bigger level.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And that's a good segue. So for anyone listening, Families Together is a collaborator on the trauma responsive support planning that you all are working on. And so I want to dig into that and the reasons behind why that's important. But I think as a starting point, it might be helpful to define trauma for people. And I think about it from my own perspective, and I think how casual people can be with language these days. So I'm pretty open about this on the podcast, but I have OCD and bipolar, and those are two that people use kind of colloquially.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, I'm so OCD about this, or oh, he's crazy, he must be bipolar or whatever. And they use it as this kind of casual, and I'm not personally super offended by it, but I think that trauma also can get lumped into that, where it's like, oh my God, how traumatic. And maybe it was I don't know, they gave you the wrong drink at Starbucks or something. So for people in the field really working on trauma, psychology, social work, what is trauma? How should people be thinking about trauma these days as we go into ways to make it better systemically?
You want to start with that one, or?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I would say trauma is an experience that a person has that overwhelms the system to be able to cope. So what one person may experience as traumatic may not necessarily be traumatic for another person. And there's complex trauma, which oftentimes it's not one single event. It's an accumulation, a combination of many events, and that just increases the complexity of it, right? You're coping with one, and then another one comes along, or there's the chronic food insecurity, homelessness at times, parent neglect. It could be many different things. But I think coming back to that system of it overwhelms the system to be able to cope. Your physical system, your family system, sometimes your school system. Yeah, so I think that's kind of how I'd summarize it. And sometimes, again, if one person experiences a similar event to another, it might be a matter of one has more resources, right? So they can navigate that challenge as a lot better with more support in a way that's not going to have as negative of an impact on them versus a person who doesn't have the resources to be able to cope and navigate with that.
Okay, I like what you said, and it made me think of a follow-up question. And you kind of spoke to the complexity of trauma, not only for the individual, but also the fact that what one person sees as a trauma might be different from another person. And so now we have a very complex topic, because what resonates with one person might not for another, and even with those own individuals, there's layers of complexity. And it kind of reminds me of nutrition in a way, where we want to be able to know what's good nutritionally for everyone, but one person really thrives with nuts, and the other person is allergic to nuts. And one person, their bones are growing great with cow's milk, and the other person's throwing up the cow's milk. So as we look with a bird's eye view, and maybe this is kind of TRSP, how we can maybe get into that a little bit, but are there fruits and veggies in like the mental health trauma world that we should be thinking about, that basically everyone, regardless of the complexities of your own situation, are there things that everyone would benefit from? Coping skills, regulation, stuff like that. What do you think?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I loved how you were putting that, because I'll back up a little bit before I answer your question directly. I realized I never told you why I got into this, but it's related to what we're talking about. When I started my master's degree, I knew I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, and that was the goal. But just some reading I was doing in my personal life, just like books that weren't academic, right? And just kind of for learning about life and the world. I became so fascinated by the different paths that people's lives take. Same life experience, vastly different outcome, right? And I just was like, what is that about? How can some people, I was reading books about, people experiencing being child soldiers, right? And then they go on to write a book about it. And I'm like, okay, resilience is hard to define, but I'm going to go ahead and say that was resilience, right? Like this person who went through that and then lived to tell about it and had the energy to tell about it, right? And trauma is just, it's so personal, and I really appreciated that you highlighted, what is traumatic for one person is not for another. We can never make assumptions about what's going to be traumatic and at what point in their life they're going to realize the impact of what happened. Some people realize it immediately. Some people realize it years and years later. I appreciate, though, with those differences in responses, this idea well, what vitamin should everybody be taking? What water should everybody be drinking? And two things come super readily to mind for me. One is, I really believe it's a fundamental human right to feel safe and secure. And I believe that very few people have 80% of their day where they feel safe and secure. I mean, we're never going to feel safe and secure all the time, right? Like you drive a car and it's taking a risk. Right. But like, I feel like some people, because of the resources that they have and the connections that they have, get to feel a lot more safety and security, on a daily basis. And when you feel that most of the time, the impact of a life event that doesn't jive with that might be easier to overcome, right? Not all the time, because sometimes it really conflicts with that worldview, and that's like an existential thing that's hard to deal with. But, that's one. And we talk so much about like, how can we make classrooms just feel safe to kids? Like how can at least, regardless of what they go home to, those 6 hours, 7 hours a day, how can we make those hours be times when they can let down their guard and relate and grow? And that leads to, something else that I think is really fundamental is connection. And I'm starting to use the word connection sometimes more than relationships, because not all relationships that we have are uniformly positive. Like, I think a relationship is an opportunity to have connection that resonates with you and that is helpful to you. But like, if people ask me to define my relationships, I might be like, these ones are good. And these ones I'm like, ooh, 10-foot pole, right? And so, you have to have relationships to have opportunities for connection, right? But we need, safe, stable, nurturing relationships that have longevity, right? If something bad happens to a kid, like Laura and I might have good ideas about what can be done in the environment, but we're not the best people to step in for an individual kid. Because we're not going to be there on the long term, and the more of the job, I think, is really building communities and systems where those safe, stable, nurturing adults are available consistently to know people and to be there for them as a resource before and after something bad happens.
Man, so much that you said there, so thought-provoking, and I'm trying to decide where to direct the conversation.
Yeah, sorry, I just let it roll.
No, it's great. It's great. I think safe, stable, and nurturing tends to be one of the taglines, per se, for a condition for success for someone who's had a traumatic experience. Safe and stable. I think most people could take a guess at what safe and stable means. Maybe they're in a home environment where there's not a bunch of yelling and throwing things around. Maybe they have consistent connections. I won't say relationships. It's consistent connections that are stable, and maybe even things like, food security. Maybe they have healthy food at home. Right. Nurturing is the one that I want to kind of double click on here. So what does it mean for someone to be in a nurturing environment versus a non-nurtured environment? And either one, for any of these questions, either one of you can jump in. This is just totally open.
Well, I would say the predictability and the safety part certainly are a good foundation to get to that nourishing part, right? Somebody that sees you as you are, listens, sees you as you are, and also your potential for what you can do, and acknowledges that. I think that's a huge piece of being nourishing. And then also space for the parts that a person might see as their ugly self, right? Their shame, what the trauma might, kind of create oftentimes, right? So we have some principles with our trauma responsive lens, and one of my favorites in there is that the belief that healing happens in relationships, because a lot of that healing you can't necessarily do all on your own, right? It has to be in connection with other people in relationships. So I think that safety and really feeling seen and heard, and the space for the ugly parts too.
Yeah, it is so much about meeting people where they are. I mean, you can feel lonely in a crowded room, and you can feel comforted when you're alone. I mean, right? Like, And I think, this nurturing is knowing people. It's knowing their names. It's knowing where they're from. It's being curious about who they are as individuals. It is really much more than being around. And like my child psychologist training, always reminds me of, people like Vygotsky who are talking about, if you want to teach a child something, you have to know where they are so that you don't overshoot and make them feel like, I don't have any skills, I can't get this, but also so that you don't bore them, right? And children are incredibly unique. We put them in first grade, second grade, third grade. Their skills are all over the place. For some kids, their motor skills are highly developed early, and other kids, their verbal skills kind of show up first. And when we just assume everybody's in the same place because they're 5, because they're 6, because they're 7, we are not nurturing them. In my opinion, I think you really have to know the child and where they are and what skill they are blossoming and interested in so that you can know where to meet them. And when you meet someone where they are, I think they feel it. I think they feel seen. I think they feel respected. And I think that is the start point of nurturing. And then you're able to help nurture a skill or emotion regulation, or, whatever it is that child might need.
Yeah. It's kind of what you're both saying, which is, one, you have to meet them where they are to validate where they are. Yeah. But you also have to recognize the potential.
Yes.
And you have to verbalize that potential, to put some fuel in the tank about, hey, I know this is where you're at now. Knowing you as a person and your skill set, I also see you here, but we need to work to get there gradually so that you don't put too much of an emphasis on this person that you are yet to become, and you can focus on the present moment. Yeah. Is there, as we kind of linger on the effects of trauma, what are some, you spoke to shame, guilt, things that can affect someone's behaviors and outcomes long after a traumatic incident. What are some of those main roadblocks? Someone has incurred some traumatic situation where their system's overloaded. They know that they're a great person, that they're a resilient person, but there are some roadblocks that will come. What are some of those, and how can they hurdle those?
Do you want to take that? Or you want me
to? I can certainly start. There can be so many. And I think that is the most frustrating and also motivating part of working in this field, is that the way that trauma can impact or affect a person is broad and varied. And I think that is sometimes what leads to people being like, oh, these people just keep saying it's trauma, but really this person's just being defiant, or they're just manipulating me, or they just don't like school and they don't want to be here, but me being so steeped in this world, I'm like, yeah, that can be what it looks like for that person. That can be what it looks like for that person. So what I always like to go back to is remembering that our brains and physiology and bodies are ready to adapt and survive whatever comes our way. Okay. And so, if we experience a hard time, our body is ready to say, okay, like, what was this hardship and what do I need to employ to get through it? And whatever we employ to get through it, depending on how strongly we had to employ that, how frequently we had to employ that, that's potentially going to become our new way of functioning, right? So when people talk about like trauma in the brain, I think sometimes the message that gets sent is like people are like brain damaged or brain deficient in some way because of the trauma that happened to them. I think that's a really basic and inappropriate view of what we're really talking about. Trauma changes the brain, and our brains are amazing enough to adapt, right, to what happened. So we have to then take the strengths-focused view and say, if a brain can change its patterns and its typical ways of responding due to trauma, it can do it again due to the presence of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, right? Due to the presence of consistent, repetitive experiences that help people focus on their strengths and realize they have agency and efficacy. And so it's a hard question for me to answer, like what are the roadblocks? Because for some people it's defensiveness. For other people it's giving up, and it can look like depression. For other people it's hypervigilance and always being on alert. For some people, they can't even think about the future because they're like, if I do that, I'm going to miss the threat in my current environment, right? So yeah, I have a harder time like distilling the roadblocks, right? Because I think they are so individual.
But I think all of what you kind of summarized explains the amazingness of the brain, but comes back to the safety piece, right? Traumatic events are nearly always a threat to safety. Mental, emotional, psychological, or physical safety, one or multiple. And so, all of those roadblocks generally are around that. And we come back to how do we create the safety piece, the more safety to be yourself, right? Mentally, emotionally, and then physically safety, right? Because we know they're all interconnected, but, and you need to attend to both. More than two, but multiple, all of those levels of safety, really, I think, to overcome whatever the barriers are.
Oh, I want to ask you guys so many questions. Can we make this a 3-hour-long episode? Because I'm ready. Something you said, let's go here first. So I love that what you said about safety, and I'm curious about how far back we can zoom out, because so let's take COVID as an example. So we know that people can experience an individual trauma. Maybe you got in a car accident, maybe you were abused, something like that. And then everybody kept saying, we're experiencing a collective trauma with COVID. And then you talk about the teachers, the ones who are saying, oh, he's just saying that because he wants to get expelled so he doesn't have to be in school. It's like, he might be saying that because X, Y, and Z happened in his childhood. So what are some coping skills or things to consider from kind of the more system level, where we know we need an individual to be safe, to succeed? How do you make a batch of 50 teachers and administrators feel safe enough to be responsive to the needs of everyone that they're overseeing? Does that make sense? Because the trauma becomes more and more collective depending on the scenario. And we know teachers and staff are stretched thin right now in schools. So how do they kind of, as a group, regulate themselves so as to not activate some of the traumas? I know it's a tough one too, but I mean, that's kind of part of your work, right? With TRSP. So maybe we can go there. What do you think?
I think it's one of the hardest issues that we face, that it's typically never just the child who was affected. And we're saying, oh, safe, stable, nurturing, predictable, consistent. And then we are leaning on people who may not have had that themselves early in life. They may not have that now. It can be one of those things that if you just think about that side of it, I think you're like, how are we ever going to turn the tide, right? Like this is a big problem. I think, we talk about how early life trauma can be so impactful and really kind of set the stage for, what we call like a developmental cascade of, challenges later in life. But the fact of the matter is, resilience can be built at any age and anyone, and that includes adults, and I think a lot of adults were never taught things like self-regulation and the usefulness of routines and valuing sleep. And, I think even just culturally here in the US, not to paint too broad of a stroke, we've got this productivity mindset instead of this connection mindset. I mean, I know I certainly feel as if I was raised in a culture of that, not even just saying, my family, just like how I feel like I was raised by this nation, and I think it has been so hope inspiring for me to see adults learn about trauma and the impact of trauma, and then to also learn that in the face of this really big thing, their emotional regulation is the best predictor of how a child is going to do. I think it can be so empowering at the same time, even if and when they are feeling unsafe themselves. I think that knowledge in some ways puts the power and control back in their hands. Trauma takes away the power. But when we give the power back and we say, despite all of this, I'm telling you, if you show up and you're predictable, and when kids do something you don't like, you respond firm but kind every time, that's making an impact. And when people really let themselves realize that, you just see like this melting away of like, almost like I thought it was going to be way harder.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah. And I think on an individual educator level too, that piece of it's okay to model it, right? Like you're not putting your feelings on the kids, but to say, I'm feeling kind of sad today, or I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed today. I'm just going to take a minute. When you can do practices integrated throughout your classroom, whether they're brain breaks, mindfulness breaks, connection, take a break from like content and academic, and we do a connection game, community building, but to model that, like that it's okay, it's actually good that you can do that for yourself, for your class, and then I think as a systems level, when you can create an environment of that, like right, our educators don't have to have it all together all the time. They need each other for support and connection. When they can have consistent, predictable aspects of their work, right? When the administrator can help support that. When our educators and our administrators are supported, they can do a better job of supporting the kids and the families, right?
Well, and this is what we talk about in our trauma responsive support planning process is, we're really trying to roll that out right now in systems where people are bought in from the top down, because what we don't want is, individual teachers or, individual building principals being super bought in, but then not having any supports, within their system and within their community to roll that out. Because doing this alone can feel really, really hard. And there are a lot of teachers and individuals out there doing this alone and staying regulated, right? And finding their own community and doing it even though they might not be getting reinforced by their administrators for doing it. There are plenty of those people out there, and I'm forever grateful for the strength and the hope that they bring. But if we're really going to make a tidal wave of change, we have got to be creating trauma responsive systems, where really everybody from the top of the, you hate to say hierarchy, but schools are kind of hierarchical,
right?
To, people who, work most directly with kids who I think, largely are doing the most impactful work directly on a daily basis, are on board and are building that community with each other and are admitting to each other when it's really, really hard, when a kid does something that feels so disrespectful. You've poured so much in the bucket and then the kid still does that thing, right?
Yeah.
They need each other in those moments. They really do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's to create systems changes, it is kind of focusing on the individual, like you're saying. And then especially as you target leaders per se, principals, that's going to spill down culturally to everyone else. Let's kind of take the individual, though, just for a moment to kind of push back on something that you had brought up, which is the mental, emotional, and physical components of the individual and trauma and all that. And maybe we can have a quick conversation around kind of the mind-body connection. And that's as you're speaking to the ability for people to regulate themselves, one of the things that I love so much about the trainings that you all do is you require that the room checks in with their bodies, not just their minds, because people tend to get lost in this control center up here, and they forget that there's a lot of intelligence all throughout their body, and that it can be a signal for something that needs to be heard before the mind a lot of times. So for people who have either incurred trauma or maybe in a family unit where there's something going on, in a classroom where there's something going on, what are some of the bodily triggers that someone should be aware of that's also going to connect to their mind?
Yeah, it's just as unique, right, for each person.
Totally agree.
I think part of it is just helping raise awareness and giving people the space to tune into this. So for me, sometimes when I'm thinking a lot or stressed or tense, like I clench my jaw, right? And sometimes just my mind's working and my jaw's clenched, and sometimes just a high like thought thinking place, and sometimes it's stress, right? For some people, lots of digestive stuff, really, it comes into play. Stomach aches, constipation, a variety of things. The digestive really relates to trauma. Certain people, they're like, you know what, my right calf like twitches. It's so weird. I don't know. It can be that individualized, but a lot of people, stress in their neck. They tense up their shoulders. We can all probably visualize somebody getting angry in the clenched fists, right? Some people visibly get red if there's something that direct, like around anger. But it depends on the emotions. There are specific emotions that tend to show up in different ways in the body, that there is some, there's a study done on it, which I can't think of right now, but some commonalities with the human experience. All right, when you feel depression, it's might feel colder in a certain part of your body. When you feel sorrow, you feel it in a different place here. When you feel shame, it's I think it's like more on your face, and it's a really nice visual of it. I wish I could think of that study. There is some common aspect of certain feelings and where and how we feel them in our body, but that it is very unique for each person what stress they feel, and then it also can be connected to your trauma reminders. So depending on what those traumas are, and then what environment or sensory thing you're exposed to, sight, smell, sound, whatever it may be, may trigger certain things within you. So
yeah, I love getting to hear other people talk about this, because it helps me almost like reflect, like what do I think about this? And I think trauma can affect both the body and the mind. When we go through something that threatens our safety, we literally engage in a biological process to help withstand that, right? We've all probably heard of fight, flight, freeze, right? And if something really scary is happening, we will very naturally tend to run from it, fight it, right? Or play dead in the face of it. And that involves our biology. If I'm going to fight something, my heart rate had better be a lot higher, and my respiration rate had better be a lot quicker, and I'd better divert blood away from my stomach and not digest food right now, because it's got to go to my heart and pump blood. Okay, so there are a lot of physiological changes that help us fight, that help us flee. And when our bodies are in that place where they're ready all the time, they are not focused on rest and digest. They are not focused on digesting food. They are not focused on restorative sleep. You look at sleep studies, and people who've experienced trauma spend a lot of time in REM sleep. And while all of us need REM sleep, too much REM sleep is not great for us. Like we're, almost dreaming too much and we're never getting into that deep sleep, because we're always ready to wake up. And also our mind is constantly processing things during REM sleep, right? So like that connection with nightmares. And so, there are clear effects of trauma on the body alone. There are also clear effects on the mind alone, if we can separate them at all, which, that's been a philosophical debate since the beginning of time. But, trauma will make you wonder if the world is safe, right? Trauma will make you constantly be thinking, what do I need to do to be safe right now? And that distracts you from tasks of learning. That distracts you from tasks of connection. And, Laura alluded to this, but we really need to build that awareness in people who have experienced trauma between the mind and the body and the ways that they influence one another to help begin the healing process. Because a lot of people are very understandably not aware that a racing mind is causing tension or that tension is causing them to feel amped up and alert all the time. And so while some people it might be clammy hands, and other people it might be the jaw, and other people the shoulder tension, building that awareness that the two are connected and that there's power in knowing where we are, because if we know where we are, we can do something about it. That really becomes the key.
That's very interesting. And I think one of the things that I see, because we support a lot of youth in our program, and this can be easy to intellectualize as an adult, especially with a lot of experience under our belt. For a young person operating with this ancient hardware that you're talking about, our bodies are still running from lions and tigers. It can be much harder to cognate the fact that this is happening to my body and I'm ramped up and I'm getting ready to do something that I'm really going to regret. So I should take some deep breaths or take a walk barefooted in nature. Like that is just not a thought currently in our societal, in my perception, something that young people have like the real internalized knowledge and are, preparedness to do in those moments. What do we do? Is it just a matter of teaching these things and practicing them, or how do we,
I mean, real quickly, because I think Laura might have some really great things to say about this, but they might not have the knowledge, but I tell you, they've got the openness. I think sometimes unlike those of us who get taught these things later in life, I really do see so much openness and acceptance of these mind-body strategies in young people. It's pretty inspiring sometimes to do this stuff with them, because they're like, I did notice that.
That's true.
You're like, wow, I don't think I knew to notice that. So,
That's true. Maybe it's an advantage that they haven't experienced.
In some ways, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There is an openness, and it's like this whole new world of like, I didn't know I had the ability to shift things. I think sometimes it can be a little maybe a little simpler than we think about, but being physically active, right? Any type of sports or just being outside, being in nature, garden clubs, doing things with your hands, art and stuff like, does the art feel slimy, or, whether you're painting with your fingers or ceramics or cutting and pasting, pieces like that where we're not doing things with technology. There's so much value to our social media and technology and all of that, but it does disconnect us to our body. Yes. And the amount of video games, right? There's so many cool things you can do in video games, but you're not experiencing that with your body, right? Going out and playing paintball or laser tag would be better than playing a video game, because there's that, you get to see what your body does, and you can feel like, oh, that hurt, connection to my body right there, tripped over something, fell down. I know how that feels, So sometimes I think we can, certainly specific practices around mindfulness and awareness is powerful and needed and develops that more nuanced piece of it. But just making sure that doing, whether it's art, whether it's sports, active things outside, physically with your body are important.
Thanks for saying that, honestly, all of that, because even after I asked the question, I was like, oh, I'm so stuck in my head. Like, it doesn't have to be complicated. Yeah. And the more easy and the more intuitive it is, like painting a picture or playing catch with a baseball or gardening, like you said, the more easy and intuitive it is, oftentimes I feel is the most sustainable resolution to feeling better. And so we don't have to think ourselves out of the problem. Sometimes it's just about acting ourselves into the healing, you know?
Yes, getting ourselves into healing places, spaces, and routines.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I have some curiosities here, y'all. Okay, so we've talked about mental, emotional, and physical health systems and how that can apply. So we've been experimenting with also incorporating spirituality as kind of the fourth component of the overall life bucket: mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual health. Spiritual meaning could be a connection to nature. It could be a prayer practice, a gratitude practice. It doesn't have to be going to church on Sundays. If it is, awesome. If that's leading you towards a good life, great. It doesn't have to be a religious thing.
Right.
Do you all, in your experience of life as either individuals or the work that you do you feel like spirituality has a place in the healing of trauma?
God, we don't talk about this enough.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't. And I, just this morning, I was driving my daughter to an appointment, and we ran by an accident, and we saw a person in distress, right? And, in that moment, you don't have any agency, right? There's absolutely nothing that my daughter nor I could do. There was already help, right? Like, we didn't need to call 911. That was going on. Yeah. You know what I mean? And in that moment, I knew all we had was sending something out into the world, right? And I encouraged her to do that. And it made me feel better. I think it made her feel better, right? Because it was just like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, I'm almost like tearing up thinking about it because it just happened. It was just like, haven't had a lot of time to process it since seeing it. And, I don't think I know enough about the research. And I think we have shied away from exploring spirituality, especially in schools, because a lot of people don't see it as different than religiosity.
Right.
But I think it's important because in those moments where there's nothing in your control, is that really true? Or are there still things, right, that are in your control, that connection with like this force of nature or just this understanding that we all are connected and me, sending positive well wishes out to this person who I've never met before. It's something. When you do it, it's not nothing.
Yeah.
And it's not dissimilar from getting together with 200 people at your school on a Friday night to wear the same clothes and really hope that your team wins.
That's right.
You're putting all of your energy and you're mustering up your physical biology, but also your thoughts and your spirit on one goal. And it just makes you wonder, what if everybody directed all of that on one person who was going through a trauma or something? How might that affect them? Like you're saying. And it doesn't, I do feel like things like prayer, the word prayer, stuff like that can be triggering for people. And I know there's even a subsect of trauma. I learned about this recently. There's a religious experience trauma.
Religious trauma.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's,
absolutely.
You don't want to do further harm by focusing on the more dogmatic. But I think what we're talking about is a connection to something beyond yourself.
Yeah.
And if you feel like there's nothing left, there's always something left.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Laura, on spirituality and trauma?
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. It's complex and tricky. For us, especially supporting the schools, right? It's a tricky conversation, separation of church and state, and how do we sort of invite and allow space for it where it's not pressure or dictation of something, right? And a really broad space of what that could be. But I don't know a lot of the research either myself, but I think allowing space for it is important. And even if that people wouldn't even use the word spirituality, but whether it's faith, like faith in humanity, connection to other humanity, something bigger than themselves, right? Because for those that are agnostic or atheist, like that word spirituality may not even feel good, right? But they may be like, connection to humanity, I'm on board with that, right? Like I definitely believe in that piece of it. So I think some of that kind of comes back to how do you invite on an individual level, right? How do you invite that worldview? Support that. And offer things too, right? Sometimes like what meditation or a prayer or well wishes or positive vibes, like
it's the same thing.
All of that is an offering of sometimes this feels really good when you feel helpless.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here. TASN will be researching spirituality on trauma, and Erin and Laura have volunteered to head that up.
We're going to navigate all the complexities.
We'll be curious to read those findings. So as we kind of guide towards the back half of this conversation, I do want to talk about one other important thing to me in understanding trauma from the experts, and that's generational trauma. When you guys did the training, the case study that you presented, there was a lot of generational stuff going on. There were a lot of patterns and habits that were essentially impossible to avoid. I shouldn't say impossible because people are resilient and there's always hope. But some people come into this world with an uphill battle. So can you just help us understand what is generational trauma? How might that affect someone that's brand new to navigating the world if they've got some of that in their family tree?
Yeah, it's almost like a path dependence. It's that it can't be broken out of, but it's so understandable. You take this path and it's probably going to lead to that path and probably going to lead to another similar path unless something comes in and kind of forcefully breaks the chain. We've been talking about trauma thus far, we've been talking about the physical and the mental and the emotional effects. And I think there are multiple reasons why generational trauma exists. For starters, we have shared genetics with our families. And so we just might be prone to respond to life events in similar ways to the people that we're related to, right? So that's one thing. And then we're learning so much right now about epigenetics, right? So if you are on board with like theories of evolution, evolution happens really slowly, like over millions of years. Epigenetics can change within a lifespan and from one generation immediately to the next generation, right? So like studies in mouse and rat mothers will show that certain types of stress experiences will literally change the chemical messengers that sit on top of the gene. So that's why it's called epigenetics. It's those chemical messengers that sit on top of the gene and tell the gene what part of it to express. Express this more survival part, or express this more rest and digest part. And so the ways that mouse mothers feel, the experiences that they have while they are pregnant lead to different sorts of behaviors that their babies are engaging in when they're born. And that's theorized to be a product of an epigenetic process, a way that stress changed the epigenome and then immediately had effects on the next generation. So that's kind of the more biological side of why we see this generational trauma be a thing. But then you also have shared experiences within families, right? Or you have the stories that you tell will be stories sometimes of the hardships that were faced by your ancestors matters because that's where learning comes in, right? Like people like us have experienced this time and time again. This is part of your story. You need to know this so that you can adapt to be ready, and sometimes we think of generational trauma as so bad, but sometimes the pathways by which it gets transmitted are meant to be protective, right? Like if you look like this, watch out for that.
Yeah.
So, right, you'll hear people of different cultures, race, ethnicities, from different countries have different things that they will teach their children to look out for. And that comes from a place of wanting to nurture.
Yeah.
Right. And so, again, trauma changes us. Trauma causes us to adapt. And the trouble comes into place when the adaptations that we've made as a family system or as an individual no longer match with our environment. When we're holding on to something that was true in a certain setting, but isn't true right here, right now. Yeah. And so, it might have benefited me to be really distrustful of adults in my home life because they abused me. But now at school, these are the very people who can heal me. It's a really hard shift to make.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I've never really thought about it from that lens. About the protective aspect specifically. Yeah. Danny behind the camera, we were talking about Native American culture before you guys showed up.
Yeah.
And we were talking about their just deep reverence for nature and animals. And then the Europeans came along and ran things way off track. And now there's a lot of generational issues. And I assume that a lot of that would be protective, which is kind of a strange, like you said, it's nurturing, but it's protecting from more trauma. And in some ways, I wonder if people, not Native Americans specifically or any race or ethnicity specifically, but I wonder if people who have been protected and trained to kind of stay small in a way. Is that making sense? Can you guys help me finish that thought? Sure. Like what?
Go for it.
Do you want, I think all of this is complex. It's tricky, right? Like it is a protective factor, and those that have experienced generational trauma are survivors too, right?
Yes,
they're here. Yes. We don't know how much of those adaptations really were necessary that they're here. And so, but then when the younger, like a person, maybe those adaptations that their parents did aren't necessary now for the new environment, and for that child or adult to like grow or do something different, it could feel scary, threatening, unsafe to parents or grandparents. And so that can be the hold to stay small, so to say, right? And that's why sometimes to heal this trauma, it takes tons of courage because of our deep connections to our family. And if you're doing something that feels different or scary or threatening, right? Yeah. Then your protective family tribe is going to be like, don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah. Right?
So it can feel like sometimes individually doing your own work that your family's preventing you from doing it. Right? And that's they're scared usually, right? Yeah. And so it can be.
Yeah, that's one you don't think about much.
Yeah.
Is the hurdle. We talk about roadblocks and hurdles is sometimes your own family unit or your own tribe preventing you from the necessary growth to heal because it's a risk.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, they're scared for you.
Yeah, and they don't want to lose you either, right? That threat of connection of like if they change too much or this or that or what, they'll leave us. Or that specific role they might have had in the family too,
it doesn't get played in the same way anymore.
All right, well, I got two more questions. One of them, hopefully they're both easy. I feel like we're raising a lot of questions here. We want to provide some solutions too. Yeah. And one's kind of solution oriented and one is just a fun thing. So the first, the solution oriented one. So with our program, with Chase, we try our best to give tools and techniques, things that could be applied today if you really wanted to, because we know that it's a lifelong journey and there are things like nutrition fitness plans, that's really great. There's, authors that do really long self-help books. That's really great. But these sometimes can be time investments over the course of a long period of time. And for people who are overwhelmed or who just need some quick hit, like if I did this today, my day would be better. We try to focus sometimes on that space. So for you all, with all your experience with trauma, if you could distill down, one or two things that someone listening to this could go do today to improve their situation if they've experienced a trauma, what comes to mind?
I'll say, I think it's important to acknowledge what you are doing, right? Sometimes that self-talk can be really critical. So anything you're doing, whether it's a goal you're trying to move towards, action steps that you've taken to like say, I did this today, good job for me. Or I took a risk, right? I did something uncomfortable, good job me, right? Yeah. Practicing gratitude is a really powerful practice. And oftentimes you say, rather than making a list of 5 things you're grateful for, to pick one and write or share a few sentences about that in depth of like why that particular experience or thing was really great for you, whether it's a really great breakfast, a great night's sleep, the fact that your favorite outfit is washed, it could be the smallest of things, but to dig in deeper and spend just a few more moments on why you're appreciative of that.
Yeah.
That's, by the way, we didn't pay Laura to say that. The Chase program. So in the 8-week Chase program, the first 2 trainings are on positive self-talk and gratitude because we feel like no matter what's going on, if you're killing it and your life's amazing, or if things are really hard right now, you're going to have to figure those 2 out in order to be present and feel good about things. So I appreciate that you said that. And I love that came to mind for you because that's important to us too.
Good. Great.
Yeah. And I think kind of at the end of your prompt there was like, if somebody has just experienced a trauma, and I think the first thing you have to do is ground yourself in your present reality. Because no matter how bad that thing was that happened, it has passed now. Now, that's not always the case for some kids, right? Like if there's domestic violence in the home, like the first thing we have to do is stop the domestic violence, right? Like we don't just throw them into therapy and say, let's work on self-talk. Like no, safety first, right? But if the trauma actually has passed, then the first thing that we need to make space for is allowing people to reconnect with their present environment, to realize and recognize, I am still here. The world is still turning, right? This is a new moment, and this moment is separate from that bad thing that happened. And the longer that we spend really not knowing, feeling, accepting, understanding that the trauma has passed, the harder it is to recover.
Yeah.
And I think we just gloss right over that. Right?
Yeah, and I gotta ask a follow-up to that because I feel like you're getting into some pretty philosophical territory about trauma in general, and I see both sides of the coin, and I don't know that I have my mind made up either way. But on one side of the coin, you experience an event, and once you're out of the event, back in a safe, stable, nurturing environment, should you choose to continuously focus on the event, that's going to prolong your healing. And so what I'm hearing you say is once the event has passed, you're better off acknowledging that, yes, it happened, but you're back in a good space, and now you can move forward with that in the past. Am I hearing that?
I like that you put a point there, because I think it's also a very individual thing how much digging into and remembering and replaying of the trauma is going to be necessary for them as part of their healing. Like some people, you can really start off with like future oriented traumas, and they don't need to do a lot of, not digging, but rehearsal of what happened so they can feel mastery over it. And some people I think really do need that, like digging back in and how did that make me feel, and what was I thinking, and how is that related to how I'm thinking now. But I think in some ways I was maybe being a little basic with that comment of like, before we can do any healing, I think we have to have a moment where we are able to acknowledge I am safe now. And so whatever it's going to take for me to heal, I can do and I can go toward. Because, like, I'll give you an example. I did a lot of disaster relief work. And in one of my research studies, I met with a girl who had experienced a deadly tornado a year ago. And when she was telling me her story, what I realized was when it destroyed her home, the tornado did. And by everything she was telling me, because it destroyed her home, when she looked up, she thought she was in the sky being carried away by the tornado. She did not realize I'm on the ground.
Wow.
The tornado has passed now. I'm safe. Nope, my home isn't here. None of my surroundings are familiar. And so she stayed in this prolonged state of distress for a long time before she really understood, like, no, this ground underneath my feet is the same ground that was here 5 minutes before the tornado came through. Right. And so I think we don't often take just that minute after bad things happen to say, what are 5 things I can see? What are 5 things I can feel here? Right? Like, I am here. There is earth beneath me. And, this is a new present reality in which I am safe enough to figure out what it's going to take for me to heal from this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of sounds like, too, what you're speaking to a little bit is giving yourself the empowerment of that moment. Yes. It's really about empowerment.
I would agree.
It's about taking the power back, putting it where it belongs.
Taking the control back. Yes.
Yeah. And so just to kind of finish the thought before, it's like, I do feel some people think that it's more event oriented and what you focus on expands. And so if you were to continuously focus on the trauma, that will continue to pose trials in your future by reliving it all the time. And then in another camp, maybe it's more like, it's important to relive the moment. It's important to work through it and continuously focus on it for the deepest healing. And it sounds like maybe it just depends on the person a little bit. Yeah.
I think we have to follow people's lead in the healing process and be maybe a little more comfortable with that too. With them having internal wisdom. We've struggled in the trauma field. We've called people victims for years, patients.
Yeah.
Laura's like, no, they're survivors.
Oh, yeah.
They're people who something bad happened to.
Yeah. And now they're teachers.
Yeah.
Because they get to share what worked for them. And that's part of being the one whole as a community,
I think it's some of helping them recognize they're survivors, right? Yeah. Their body and brain did whatever it needed to in the moment to help them survive that and that space of survivors. But how do we help you get to thrivers, right? We're not continually looking for threats, living in that state of flight, fright, or freeze.
Yeah.
Got that all mixed up. Right? You know what I'm trying for.
Fawn
Fight,
now too.
Flight, or freeze.
Flock.
Yeah.
We got a lot of them these
fawn.
days.
Yes, all of those things. But able to get to that space eventually or intermittently of thriver.
Yeah. So check in with your gratitude. Check in with your self-talk. Erin ran through a really simple mindfulness technique. Let's just real quick flag that again. You mentioned 5 things you can see for. What is that exercise?
Yeah, so there are a lot of exercises that I think are similar in nature that kind of get clumped together under this this term grounding. Grounding can be really helpful if you're experiencing a panic attack, right? If you're just kind of losing connection. I don't want to say with reality, but you're kind of struggling to get control of thoughts or bodily sensations. And so one grounding technique that, doesn't require any tools and that, hopefully is fairly easy to do that you can cue people in is, our senses are the way that we first learn anything about the world is through our senses, through what we can see, feel, hear, smell, taste. And so if our senses are telling us, it's scary, right? If like the room is bright red and there's a bunch of noises going on, like all of us are going to feel a little like, ooh, are we, amped up? And so our senses can overwhelm us. Our senses can also calm us incredibly efficiently. Mm. And so asking people, what are some things in your environment that you can see, and then running through the other 5 senses, right? What are some things that you can feel? What are some things you can hear? What are some things you can taste, if that's, relevant? And what are some things that you can touch?
Yeah.
And just kind of really giving people a moment to explore each of those senses can allow this opportunity for them to get a signal from the world that, hopefully you're doing that when they actually are safe, right?
Yeah,
and in
right.
a space that isn't overwhelming. So you might need to pick your spot. But gosh, even in a chaotic environment, reminding yourself like my feet are on the ground.
Yeah. And how important is that now more than ever with phones? And you mentioned video games and everything in moderation, social media, if it's a couple 10 minutes a day or whatever is one thing, but as we get continuously more distracted into technology and the grind set culture, how important is it to be in reality with your senses? It sounds so simple, but it's so important it's
foreign to us.
And it's like the first thing we learned.
Yeah.
It's wild. Well, I want to leave it on a high note. And this is called the Chase Your Dreams podcast. And we try to going back to the beginning of the conversation is help people aim high, for their dreams in life. Mm-hmm. Of course, we want to work on those determinants of health, like your shelter and your food and all that. But once we've got those bases covered, how can we aim high? How can we chase those dreams? So my question for you two is, are you currently living any dreams you've always had, or are there other dreams, or maybe both? Are there other dreams in life that you have yet to chase?
This is
and Erin coming hot off the Oklahoma tennis trip.
I was gonna say. I mean, I want to win a national tennis tournament, and I'm gonna keep trying.
As you should.
But Laura knows this, and people who spend time with me know this. I think it's so important to have balance in our lives and to have multiple areas of our lives in which we're wanting to grow. Because one, you'll learn tools and techniques from one to the other, and I think, I shared with you that our team came in second yesterday. We didn't get to win. But wow, did we ever learn things? And I think what we learned yesterday was like a lot of teamwork related stuff. I think we learned that some of us were on different pages about what the goals were, and then like that's a big takeaway, for the next effort. And so then that gives me insights into like when we're in this workspace, like. It really is important for teams everybody plays a different role, but what's the goal, right? And how are we going to take all of our diverse abilities and put them all toward these really important goals? But professionally, I think for me, one of my goals is to be able to sustain a lifetime of work in this area that is emotionally charged and challenging. We see a lot of burnout, and that's not anybody's fault. But I think it's something that is really important to guard against and to be thoughtful about, because it's really a marathon working in this field. And, we brought up the teachers being with these students every day, and it's really hard, and I want to be able to build systems that can sustain not only my own career, but theirs, because this work is really important. Yeah,
that's amazing. And thank you so much for the work that you do. I can tell the way you speak about it, that you're so passionate, and I can really feel that being in this room. So for what it's worth, I think you're doing an amazing job. And
thank you.
A marathon is a long race. That finish line might be a mirage right now, but eventually you'll get there if you stick to it.
Yeah.
So thank you for the work you're doing. Laura, how about you? Any dreams?
Oh, lots of dreams. I don't know what I'll talk about today, though. I'll stick to the professional part, I guess. I would say in many ways, what I'm doing is beyond what I dreamed or thought I would do. Being able to kind of do this work at a state level versus at a district level is really exciting, and just all the connections to have been able to make and bigger impact on. I guess I like the idea of being able to uplift educators, right? Having kind of lived some of that and be like, it can get better, feel empowering in that way, and just continue sort of on this path beyond trauma responsive schools, but our trauma responsive school communities. How do we build our resilient communities and recognize what's already going well in them, right? So often we talk about systems change, and there's the assumption that we need to change everything, and that's not true, right? Sometimes there's really good things going, and how do we just build and enhance on that. And sometimes it's a matter of simplifying and bringing back what used to be done.
I agree.
Back to the, just connection and community.
Yeah. Well, I love that's twice now in the conversation, Laura, that you've brought it back to, but there's also good things that you're doing in it. One was on the individual level. First thing you can do is just pat yourself on the back for doing a good job.
Yeah.
And then also as a community, creating these systems, acknowledging that some things are working and that some progress is being made, and that is so important. So thank you so much for flagging that, because it can be so tempting and easy just to focus on what's broken and what needs fixed, as opposed to congratulating ourselves on what's working. I also think it's really cool that you've been able to assist more and more people by broadening the overall map. You went from a district to a state, and maybe from just trauma work to your schools to school communities. And so I think it feels like the more that you dig into this, the calling is greater and greater to help more people. And so that's really beautiful to hear too. So those are awesome dreams. Those are awesome dreams. And thank you for being here. I mean, I feel good about this conversation. For people who want to learn more about the work you're doing, I know you do a lot of behind the scenes kind of stuff in education, but is there somewhere that they can go to learn about TRSP or what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, we can give our website for sure.
Yeah.
Cool,
or, because we have lots of great resources on our website. Our website will also connect you to our Moodle page. So we have some online courses, and there's many of those courses that anyone can self-enroll. You can create your own account and self-enroll. So we have a course on the trauma responsive school communities. So really understanding those trauma responsive principles better and kind of what they look like. And so that it's open to anybody. It doesn't have to be people in the schools or educators. It can be really helpful for parents and caregivers to just understand a little bit more about trauma, the impact, maybe understand themselves a little bit better in a way, right? Of their own experiences, and then what are some things to do. So I would say those are our two big resources that we'll give you that you can put on our website.
We have a Facebook page that we are trying to be diligent about, letting people know when there are new trainings or course opportunities or online courses. I think it's literally School Mental Health Initiative. Trying to think of the actual tag for it, but yeah, we, some of the work that we do is, more targeted toward, systems who are kind of really ready to make a big effort. But we certainly have a lot of resources and courses available, like Laura said, for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about how to be trauma responsive and how to be a catalyst for bringing about excitement toward moving toward becoming a trauma responsive system, because that buy-in has to come from somewhere.
Yes, definitely. Well, thanks for sharing, and to take one of Laura's tips. I'm very grateful for this conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for highlighting
thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll put all the courses and everything in the show notes, so it's really easy for people to access. And let us know what you thought. You can now text us from Spotify and Apple. So if you loved this episode, tell us what you loved about it. And thank you so much for coming on to the Chase Your Dreams podcast. I'm sure I'll see you in a Zoom meeting at some point soon.
That's right.
Sounds
Thank you for
great.
your partnership with us too.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you
absolutely.
so much.
Awesome. All right. Sayonara. Bye-bye.